Over the last 2 decades, Canadians have come to understand that public events must begin with a land acknowledgement. This is not simply an acknowledgement that this land was once entirely under the responsibility of different Indigenous nations. This responsibility remains. It is a far more sophisticated concept than the crude Western idea of ownership defined by mere buying and selling. It has to do with how we imagine ourselves. We are part of the land, not the dominators of the land. 3 of the writers taking part in today's conversation live in Germany. The rest of us are in Montreal, Saskatoon, Edmonton, and I'm in Toronto. Here, I'm on the traditional territory, most recently, of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This is also the territory of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. All of us, Indigenous and newcomers, have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. This concept of the dish with one spoon has great importance because it is a call for egalitarianism, that we all sit around the same bowl and we all eat from the same spoon. It is a call for inclusion. Next year, October 2021, Canada will be the guest of honor at the Frankfurt Book Fair. The overarching theme is singular plurality. And here we are warming up next year's physical conversation with a 2020 virtual get-together. Today we're 8 writers from Canada and Germany, and I'd like us to question, how do we imagine ourselves? How do we imagine citizenship, or the rejection of citizenship as we know it? What does it mean to be or to have been a refugee, an immigrant, or from the same place for what seems like an eternity? How do we imagine inclusion and belonging, or deal with exclusion and division? What does this mean for the crises we find ourselves in? Some provoked, some simply revealed by COVID, some of it dating back 200 years, 150, 40 years. And hidden somewhere in all of that, what is the path forward? So I'd just like to begin with a very simple, ironic, I suppose, question. Where are you from? And André.
So, it's probably more problematic that I had to think about this question. Because if you asked me, you said, hey, where are you from? I go, Canada. Especially now that I'm in Berlin, if somebody asks me, I do say Canada. And if they want more information, I'll say Toronto. But if I have to think about it, I have to say, well, I was born in Trinidad in 1957, came to Canada in 1961, I think it was 62, and have been more or less in Canada since then. But the influence of the place that I was born is huge because my parents, of course, were Trinidadian, and much of the culture that I had when I was growing up was from Trinidad. So I'm a Canadian who is deeply influenced at the most sensitive time of growing up by a Caribbean culture.
Chelsea.
Tanse, Chelsea Val Nitigason, Iguamantu Sakaigenik Nitotsen, Maganiwigin Utam Squatsi was Gaigenek notes. So I'm from Lac Saint Anne, which is west of Edmonton. And I'm still within my traditional territory. We're residing within Treaty 6 territory here. And other than a stint living up in the Northwest Territories and a bit of time in Montreal, my family and I have always lived here. So I'm very deeply rooted in this particular territory. And when I speak to an international audience, I say I'm from Canada because that's the only thing that's legible. But when I talk to Canadians, I'm always adamant that I'm not Canadian. I'm Métis from Lac Saint Anne.
Jaafar.
When I'm asked, where are you from? I say I'm from Germany because that's how I feel today, how I define myself. But people would answer and say like, no, where are you really from? Not, So then I say my parents are from Lebanon. I've been born in Liberia. I've been living in Switzerland, and in Lebanon, in London, in Paris. And that's the question that always makes me think again and again. What do people expect? Do they want to know what they want to hear, where they define you, where you're from? Or do they really trust and just leave it the way you define yourself, which I see is a right for myself to define and say where I am from?
Yann.
I am from that state of mind called Canada. I was born, as it happens, abroad in Spain, and I've lived abroad because my parents were diplomats, so representing Canada abroad. But I'd say I'm from, I said, that state of mind called Canada, and specifically I live now in Saskatchewan, that attempt at logic, because it's a rectangular shaped province. I've been living here for 20 years. In some ways it's typical, atypical, the way every part of Canada is, in its lack of diversity, and its great diversity, its hidden diversity. So in some ways a very typical Canadian province.
Tanja.
I'm from a town called Bamberg with a millennium of history under my feet. At one point, they burned 1,000 of their fellow citizens, and at another point, they welcomed more than 1,000. And where we have a monument in our city park, which says, "It's here where the poet E.T.A. Hoffmann met the talking dog, Berganza." So it's a place where dreams come true and nightmares, and that's where I'm from.
Yeah.
Well, I thought it was an easy question, but then it took me a whole night to think about it. And I think, and I was going to say I was born in Vietnam until the age of 10, but then it's not the Vietnam that I know today. So I think I was born in a country at war. And I have been brought up, or I have grown, I'm made of peace, actually, because I've been living in Canada for the last 40 so years. And but then when you're in Canada, then because I'm a Francophone, so I have to say that I'm from Quebec and not Canada, because people think that in Canada we speak mostly English and not French, but I write in French, I think in French, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's kind of a difficult question. But I like to say that I come from all these places, war and peace, Vietnam and Canada and Quebec, even though they're, they are very different from one another, and it makes it a great cocktail, I find.
Ulrike.
Well, when I listened to Jaafar, I realized that hardly anybody ever asks me where I'm from. People see me and they hear my voice, and I've been living in Berlin now for kind of 20 years, and they always assume that I'm from Austria. And when I go to the north, everybody assumes that I'm from Sweden, but nobody asks. So I'm happy about that, because I would know what to answer. Because, I was born in Munich and everything was wrong. I wasn't male, I was left-handed, and I was born and raised as a Protestant, and my father's family came from Silesia, which is in Poland now. So I never felt at home at all, and I left the earliest moment I could. And then I got some of my education in England and returned to Germany for my writing, and moved to Berlin. And I've lived in many parts of the world. So in the end, if anybody ever asked me where you're from, I would be so glad to answer. I think I'm from the country of writers, I suppose, and I hope.
So for myself, I feel physically touched when I'm in the Canadian prairies. It's just like the Russian steppes, and it overwhelms me whenever I'm there in the rolling hills and everything. So, but of course, in my, I guess, real life, I think of myself as a multiple personality. I'm a writer. I don't know how we can write without having a multiple personality. And that's really probably the country I live in. And I'm wondering whether you would all think the same about, as writers, we must have multiple personalities. And perhaps everybody needs to admit that they have multiple personalities. And how do we apply this to, and maybe that'll come later in the conversation, but how do we apply this in the midst of this hydra-headed crisis that we're in today?
I don't know if I see myself as having multiple identities, multiple personalities. I wouldn't say personalities. I think I would just love to live in a place where I'm accepted and respected for who I feel I want to be, and which is according to the law. And that's the way I think about everything I do every day. It's I have a base which is called human rights, which is called freedom, and this is the thing that gives me the reason for do whatever I'm doing and to believe in all what I do and in every step I make in my life. And I don't know if it's that too complicated, but that's actually my compass. I just want to be doing what I love, feeling free, respected. And I think when you're free and feel respected, then you get the best out of yourself.
I think it's important to stress that, in fact, it would be easier to be writers if we were multiple personalities. What we are doing is we are coming from a central place, and the act of imagining the other is an act of sympathy and intimacy. But, and if you're good at it, you can catch a voice, you can catch a different set of concerns from your own. But I think you're still grounded in a self, not necessarily limited to that self.
The idea of speaking for the other or being the other is not really how I think about being a writer. You know, I'm living in a colonized space within a nation state that my people, the Métis, never agreed to, and in fact, you know, very vehemently opposed. So a lot of the work that I do is meant to speak to the other, to try to bring a Métis perspective and Indigenous worldview to the other, so that we can be understood. You know, a lot of it is sort of trying to capture our own humanity and offer that up and say, look, we're people. Maybe respect us a bit more. And I think more and more I'm less interested in that and more interested in simply representing the worldview that I come from, which is international. You know, we had lots of treaties with other Indigenous nations. It's diplomatic, it's rooted in place, and rather than coming from a rights-based framework, it's based in reciprocal obligation. What do we owe one another as human beings, as more than human kin, you know, towards the land and all of that?
I think the obligation towards another is a very important point, because let's face it, this is a terrible time for many people, but especially for journalists right now, who are also writers, and they're silenced and getting killed all the world over. And we talking to each other are sort of in different degrees, of course, in the privileged position of having an audience who listens to us.
I think of myself as mainly rooted in stories. I write stories in the form of short stories and mainly novels. And I think of stories as the glue that binds us together as individuals and that bind us with other people, whether it's national groups or religious groups or ethnic groups. What holds us together in such groups are stories. And when I'm working on a story, I don't actually think of myself as anything but an eye that's gazing out with a steady gaze, trying to create that little glue that'll bind us together.
So I'm hearing an undertone here that's really periodically people are talking about rights or the misuse of rights, and periodically people are talking about responsibilities, and sometimes being assumed and sometimes not, and how hard it can be. And Kim, just, you don't have to listen, but the second half of the question was a bit, how do we apply our personalities or our identities in the midst of a crisis?
Can I jump in, John, and say, I'm sorry, Kim, to interrupt you. Can I just introduce the idea that maybe if you're writing fiction and if you're writing essays, your sense of who you are and what the other is changes. I sort of feel if I'm writing an essay that I agree with what Chelsea said, that I'm trying to broadcast as much as I can from where I am and from what I am to others. But that when I'm writing fiction, I'm trying to approach something other than myself, because I'm just not interested in writing about my life and my experience so much. So the question of the other is different, depending on the genre that you're using.
You'll be horrified that I always think of my essays as fiction.
I personally don't, well, I don't know what the line is. I'm very confused in how, because I'm not really a writer yet. I'm new to this. And yeah, I know it's been 10 years, so I should say.
Some disagreement around the table.
I know, I should know what I'm doing, but I still don't. But I just want to go back to the identity thing. I think I'm very grateful to live in a country where we can have different points of view without, and discuss it openly without killing each other or censoring each other. Yes, of course, there's still problems, but comparing to where I came from, my book is not published in Vietnam because it's still there's still censorship, and the war has ended in 45 years ago, and we still misunderstand each other, the North and the South of Vietnam, after 45 years. So in a crisis, I think conversation is the main, is probably the only solution. And in order to have a conversation, and for us, for each and every one of us to open up our minds, is to use beauty. To me, beauty is the best vehicle to open up a conversation.
Well, now we're going to start our first smaller session, and with Tanja, Yann, Chelsea, and André. But I think from what we've been talking about, the logical next step would really be to focus in on this idea of narrative and what effect it has on us, and what effect it has on others, and what role writers can play in how narrative unfolds, true, untrue, attempts at being true, attempts at being untrue. In a way, the role of our histories through our stories, and how we experience the world in our lives through the narrative.
I think it's always an attempt to make sense, this seeking for narrative, especially since the current world makes so little sense to so many of us. I always say no editor would permit such a storyline like 2020 or the years before. And so the need to have a narrative that allows us to make sense of it all, that's, I think, not just true for authors, but for readers as well. So it's a reaching out, a way to come to terms with reality, this idea of narrative, I think.
It's really, dark comedy is the normal route through a period like this year. In terms of style, I don't know. It's often been the route through, because otherwise it makes no sense at all. Anybody else?
Well, I was going to say the thing that's slightly awkward about our discussion is that I think it's very hard to quantify the political impact of stories. I think it's safe to say that no book has immediately changed the world. Books eventually have changed the world. But, so we're talking about 2020. The individual writer will not write a story. Any writer, I don't think, will write a story that will immediately change the world right now. I mean, a book is a very thoughtful product that takes a long time to write, a long time to affect people. There's sort of it's a slow burning thing, its impact.
Chelsea, I thought you might have a slightly different view on the origin of stories and how stories are written.
Yeah. For Indigenous people, stories are a communal responsibility. It's something that we do to continue to pass on information about the lands that we live in, the way to be in relation, to live with the land rather than live off the land. And so my perspective as a writer is it comes with a lot of responsibilities to my community. Ultimately, I have to answer to my community. So I'm representing a singular point of view as a Métis woman who is, who looks white, who passes through the world like that, as somebody who is, growing up in this time, in this space. That's coming from me, but always, I am rooted in my community. The stories that I tell are not my own. The kind of worldview that I try to put into my both my fiction and my nonfiction writing is rooted in a communal reality, a worldview that is sort of denigrated and seen as not true. So I try to present our worldview as real, you know, and just let that assertion lie, not let anybody argue with me. But at the end of the day, everything that I do, all the thoughts that I have, all the ideas that I want to sort of express, they don't come just from me. They come from all of these deep interactions with my kin, with the lands that I live in. And again, if I do it poorly, or if I do it in a way that causes harm, my community will definitely let me know, and there are consequences for that. So it's an almost daunting responsibility that I feel that I have. I would love to take that view that as a writer, I can just, you know, it's just me, it's everything that I've absorbed, and now I'm sort of bringing something else into the world. And that is true to a certain extent, but I don't feel unfettered. And I don't think I would want to.
The notion of the individual, Yann, is really interesting, because of course, where we come from as writers is, it's the individual as a cloud. I've read a bunch of things, I've heard a bunch of things, I'm part of a community, which includes a bunch of books. And all of those things inform any story that I tell. Stories don't come from nowhere.
You're totally right, Chelsea, that of course stories come out of and join a community. I was just thinking the actual funnel there is that of the individual. And of course it has to reach and speak to a community. And André, same thing, when I said about the individual, I didn't define the individual. And I like what you said about the individual being a cloud. You know, that would explain your hair and my hair. You know, I didn't define the individual in any particular way, but putting it as a cloud is a very good way of putting it.
I think the other thing that is tricky when I think about what Chelsea says is that I feel like there is a sense when you belong to a certain community. I'm black, so I'm assumed to have sometimes by other black people a certain set of values and a certain set of goals, and also a certain set of experiences which will inform what I write from. I have a problem with that because I feel that that limits the notion of being a black writer to the set of expectations that a black community might have of a black writer. And it feels to me that while I'm deeply grateful for those who point out the there-ness and the problems of the black community, that in the sense of what a black writer can be, just as in the sense of what a black human being is, there needs to be as much grandeur, there needs to be as much range as there might be for my white contemporaries. And so we walk a very interesting line when it comes to how we are with our communities and our community's expectations, and the desire, I think, which is, I think is legitimate, to have it so that a black person is as undefinable as a white person might be. And in order to do that, there has to be a pushing of the borders of what it is to be black. And one of the ways that you can do that is through the exposure of the imagination as a multiple thing.
So let's now move to the next group. So I'm just wondering what you think we can do as writers, or how do we see it? How do we see the next step? What can we do about this confusion? What kind of, we were talking about narrative in the preceding group. What can we do with narrative in order to help people find the language? Because people don't have the language, they can't find their way through to the next stage. That's, after all, one of our jobs. What do? We're not good at a lot of things, you know, but we're very good at language. So, Ulrike.
I would like to take this up and connect with the last discussion when André introduced this concept of the undefinable, because the situation you just described, John, as a situation which kind of we are engulfed in it. It's surrounding us as writers as well, of course. And there is, at least over the last 10 to 20 years. In German cultural situation, there has been a big discussion and even growing discussion about boxes and appropriation. It's rightful to stop and to think about what are we doing and what kind of power are we exercising by taking up language, by using language. And on the other hand, what are our legitimate interests and perhaps even rights as writers, standing in for something which is a high value in our societies, a value that needs to be defended, and that is the freedom, the liberty of art. So how much do we trust empathy?
The image that I have is that when I write, is I try to get all the different angles together. And the example that I have in mind is the goldfish. You know, the goldfish in English, you call it goldfish, and in French is poisson rouge. It's a red fish, right? And in Vietnamese, we call it a Chinese fish. So the Vietnamese use the origin of the fish to describe the fish. And I didn't know why the French and the English was different. And because I have to learn all of these languages and I don't own any of the three, so I really have to study every single word almost. And so I realized that the red, we call it le poisson rouge in French, because if you look at the fish from the head to the tail, it's red. And the English, I think, look at the fish from the tail to the head, and the other side of the scale is gold. And probably this is why in English it's gold, and in French it's red, and for the Vietnamese it's Chinese. So all these different points of views are right. Nobody is wrong in this, the interpretation or the description of the fish. And so I think when I write is to share these different points of view, and that we come together and understand reality better, not the entirety of it, but a better understanding of the world and of reality.
My name is Jaafar Abdul-Karim, and it's a very typical Arab name. So I'm always asked, or when I should write anything, I'm mainly a journalist, a TV journalist. I like pictures, but sometimes I write, and I wrote a book, but people expected from me to write something about migration, about integration, about refugees. And if I would write something else, they don't care. I'm very honest. They expect from me to write this, what they connect with me as an Arabic-speaking German. If they see me as German, they would love to see me as a very successful, integrated Arab, because this should be the story, and not being the German, because when you're being the German, then the story is over. So they're still in the process of saying, we have people who are very well integrated, they speak the language, etc. But it happens to be that I'm totally okay with it. I'm totally okay with writing about migration, integration, covering the Arab countries, talking about the Arab culture, because I see it's also the strength. I don't only see it as something which is disadvantage, but it's also an advantage, because I'm filling a gap that a lot of people can't fill, because I know the different perspectives, I know the different languages, I know the different cultures, I know both point of views. And to share a perspective for the other side, if I can say the other side, to understand more about the people who arrived newly to Germany and to understand their perspective. So to build a bridge between two different points of views and be in the middle. And this was in the moment a kind of an added value, which I was able to add. And from my point of view, when I see someone, we use the Orientalist, like if someone is talking about the Arab countries from a very Western point of view, then sometimes I say okay, go there, live for 10, 15 years, know the culture, understand the people, and then please write for it. Because writing is a big responsibility.
To give one example of what Jaafar has just said is that, you know, my first cultural shock was when we arrived, and then in Quebec, the people who welcome us, they took us in, you know, physically, like holding us. and that was my first cultural shock. And to a Quebecer or to a Canadian, there's nothing, you know, extraordinary about embracing someone physically, but from an Asian culture, it was very different because we don't express our emotions so physically and so openly, right? And just to hold that mirror and show them, this is what we appreciated so much. That was the first moment where you gave us back our humanity, that we felt like we were human again and not a subhuman as a refugee, right? And the first moment that they looked at us, you know, we didn't have a mirror in the refugee camp for all the time that we were there, for 4 months in my case. And so you kind of forget what you look like. And the first time that I saw myself again was in their eyes. And I had never been so beautiful than at that moment. And I've never been as beautiful again, right? As much, because I have lost that vulnerability and that fragility. And so sometimes, you know, you don't see what you've given, you know, as a gift, as a welcoming gift to us. And so when I write is to hold that mirror and say, this is how beautiful you are.
When you mentioned this concept of giving voice to those who don't have a voice, whom we don't hear, and this really touches me deeply and actually connects to Kim as well, because for me this is at the core of my writing. Because as John said, if there's anything we maybe hopefully are good at, that is in dealing with language and in giving voice to things which go unheard because they're either tabooed or suppressed, or because people have been so severely traumatized that language doesn't come easily. And within the German society, I think that this kind of work of remembering and putting into language our own history of dealing with flight and displacement would be we haven't done that sufficiently, and that would be a very important step in order to enable us as a society to deal with the situation, the actual situations we have with all these many millions of people having lost their home countries, having had to move out, having been forced to move. So I very much like that comparison Kim just introduced. Look back to these things, these amazing things which have been done, and we've gone through them, and take some trust and take some knowledge from them in order to deal with the situations we have now. And here, literature can bridge and give and enhance these narratives.
I think that, you know, what's really wonderful is in the first session and now this session, you really, I think everybody is focusing on, well, what can narrative do? First, it's re-examining the narratives that exist in different ways, as Jaafar said, and I think also the way Kim just explained it, and the things that haven't been said, that narrative can fill the gaps, the writer can fill the gaps, because, and it comes back to what I said earlier, which is one of the most desperate things in societies is when people don't have the languages. They don't have the language, they don't have the words, they don't have the sentences. It's not their job to do that. It may come out of a population order, but it is the writer's job, that if we have any job, to provide sentences that people can use and language that people can use to deal with their own situations. So in what way do we see our involvement? In what way, what do we think we can contribute, help, clarify, drive forward, have an effect on activism, have an effect on governments? What can we do? How do you imagine yourself engaging and yet remaining what everyone here is, which is a writer independent, filled with responsibilities?
Can I introduce something that Kamala Shamsi wrote? She talked about the imagination of the less powerful by the powerful. And she was directly addressing the need for American writers to write about cultures that are not their own, specifically cultures that American culture has brutalized. She felt that if you don't allow American writers to imagine these other cultures, you're cutting off an avenue of understanding and an avenue of empathy. So for her, the act of those in power to imagine those without power is absolutely important. And she has a problem with stopping Americans, for instance, from imagining themselves as Middle Easterns and so on. She's not saying that they all do it right, or that they ought to be criticized if they get it wrong, but that the act of imagining the powerless by the powerful is crucial to some sort of communication along the lines of power. And it's something that's really stayed with me.
Yeah, I would, I think voice appropriation, Ulrike was mentioning this, has been quite debated in Canada. And I think it has little to do with empathy or the ability to hear. It has all to do with power imbalance.
The thing is, you know, are we disempowered, or has a narrative been created around us that sort of defines us to the mainstream? And the problem is when we talk about issues of authenticity, it's not that we're saying, look, there's only one singular view of any particular group. You know, Indigenous experiences are incredibly varied. You have folks who are completely disconnected, who are Indigenous, and that's like legit too. But I think about, you know, what can we do in these times as writers? And I think why it's so important to push for authentic voices is because we're really looking for solutions. We're dealing with, you know, environmental catastrophe. We're dealing with mass migration across the globe on a scale that humanity has never really seen before. And we can't just hide and not deal with it. So, you know, coming from a Métis perspective, I think that, you know, Indigenous peoples, the plurality of Indigenous peoples, we're all a post-apocalyptic people. We've experienced devastating, you know, endings to so many of our communities have been decimated. In some cases, our languages have been taken from us completely. And yet Indigenous peoples continue to survive. And so we feel that we have tools as a post-apocalyptic people that can help humanity as a whole sort of deal with the threats and the pressures that we're facing. And so if somebody steps into our place and, you know, just says what they imagine we would say, you're not getting those real tools. And, you know, we have ideas like Wakutuin, which is a Cree and Métis concept of expanding kinship for how we could deal with massive displacement. There's so many other things that we have allowed us to survive under incredible pressure, that I feel that those things are you know, it's imperative that we get that out to the rest of humanity, and that everybody who has that kind of voice and those experiences, you know, this is where we pool our thoughts and our ideas. How are we going to survive? And writers have a huge part in getting those ideas out.
You're really saying that responsibility for a writer is a place of discomfort. It can't be a place of comfort.
No, it is. Well, I think being at a place of discomfort is a kind of energy that it gives you moving. It gives you looking forward, because when you reach comfort, it's boring. There's no, you know, you have no driving force. You don't have I don't know. I don't think if you're a writer, you will ever reach comfort, because you're in a process of searching, of asking, of questioning, of looking, I know it's a process you're going through, because the moment you reach comfort, then I don't know, then your feelings are different, because the feeling we all go through are the ones also helping us to move on. And when it's comfort, it's not, I don't think so. When it's comfort, then it's like relaxing, and when it's relaxing, then you're losing something. That's my case. I'm afraid when I'm comfort, I'm relaxed. I'm really afraid.
So let me try to push us in a direction. I mean, a lot of why we're doing this session is because Canada, on the one hand, imagines itself as a piece of plurality, of complexity in terms of where people come from and what they do, and it's not always a happy story, as Chelsea points out, and others. We all agree with what you're saying on that front. but it's an idea of plurality, of complexity. And in Germany, there's sometimes there is a reality of complexity, enormous reality of complexity with every year since the last war, World War, enormous numbers of immigrants coming from different parts of the world for different reasons every single year. But people have difficulty talking about Germany as a place of immigration when in fact it quite obviously is to anybody who comes and visits. So how does the writer give some kind of voice to this concept of plurality? I know, obviously some of you already are, maybe all of you already are, but what is it that we need to do? What is our kind of obligation? What galvanizes us to give people the feeling that they can live in a world which is based on complexity and plurality as opposed to, monolithic ideas? Who'd like to go first?
I would.
Ulrike.
I think this is exactly what literature has done for centuries already, because it gets boring if it gives us characters which are just white and black. So what a good novel, for example, does show us is that nobody is just what he or she appears to be, and nobody is either good or bad, but everybody is a complex and plural case for him or herself. And this is, I think, one of the very basic and important contributions literature can give to the situation right at the moment, because it can, by telling complex stories, allowing this kind of reality we perceive to crystallize into these stories, it can enhance our tolerance of complexity and of ambiguity.
The question you asked, like how we imagine ourselves, so what's our role, maybe responsibility. I have one question that's driving me everything, whatever I do, and it is, I put myself in perspective of others, and I answer I have the question is, why can't I be who I want to be? This is like the question that's driving, and I'm driven by this question, whatever I do. And it's because I see my responsibility in it, because I have the possibility, I have a talk show, I'm writing, I have social media, millions of followers, I'm reaching a lot of people, I'm reaching a lot of community. And then I see that this question is the basic question, because we all want to be who we want to be. And in some countries, if you have a certain color, you're not able to reach what you want. If you have a certain ethnicity, you cannot be who you want to be. If you have a certain sexual orientation, you cannot be who you want to be. If you come from a certain religion, you cannot be who you want to be. And these are exactly the values I would like, through writing, through where I imagine myself, through every step I do, every morning I wake up, is to say the human rights values that we have, that's based on equality, and everyone has the right to be who or he wants to be, who or she wants to be, sorry. And this is where I see my responsibility. And I put it in every writing, I put it in every video, I put it in every talk show, I put it in every tweet, in every post, in every story, to help others be who they want to be.
I would say what literature does is remind us that despite what we may look like, fundamentally we're all chameleons. And as we cross life, we change colors depending on our circumstances, sometimes in a willful way, sometimes in an unthoughtful way, but fundamentally we're chameleons. We are multiple, and we have to accept that of ourselves and of others in the world, that we are multiple, we're chameleon-esque.
Tanja.
Well, I can't better the image of the chameleon, because that's perfect. I also think telling stories, giving voices, is an act of not just creation, but the attempt to leave something that's not yourself. It's part of yourself, perhaps, but it's not yourself. It's a transcendent act, and that's what every writer does.
The thing is, the writing and the community of writers is part of a process. So when I was growing up, there were virtually no Black people on TV. Then there were Black people, but they were problematic, like Uhuru on Star Trek, where she's only answering the phone on this big starship. But as we went on, as people pointed out those problems, as the creations were given and criticized, Black people became more and more complex in their representation. So that when I was asked by a student if I knew of white writers who had done good Black characters, I had to say, well, Athol Fugard for one. I had to say, well, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter by Carson McCullers has a great Black character. I'd say Clockers by Richard Price has great Black characters. And it is the process of hearing, fixing, changing, coming towards complexity. So the sense that the individual writer needs to do some work that will change the world is probably problematic. We're part of a community of things that go on around the idea of race or around the idea of sexuality or around these other ideas that can lead to an awareness. And the hope is that awareness leads to some sort of change.
And yet this is, I agree, and yet this is an incredibly urgent moment. There's no question as to how urgent this moment is. And decisions are being made which may lead us into remarkably dangerous areas if we're not already in them. But Chelsea.
I mean, it's always been urgent for us. Like, I get what you're saying about, the sort of the stresses that we're dealing with on a global scale now. But I mean, our histories tell us that, it is every generation deals with potentially like world-ending stuff. And,
right.
And for us, we've seen it again and again, from disease to, just we're internally displaced people right now. Despite all of the sort of rhetoric that comes out politically, our situation as Indigenous peoples hasn't particularly improved at all. And in fact, we're sort of nearing the cliff where our languages and our traditions and our knowledge and our link to the land have become so degraded because of ongoing violence that we are again struggling to exist as peoples. And I think that that's something that the human family is experiencing as well. So while I don't want to say, who gets to signal the alarm, who gets to sound the alarm and say that now this is it, guys, this is where we have to come together, this is important. Well, where was that alarm during, the transatlantic slave trade? Where was that alarm when Indigenous peoples were being massacred? So rather than thinking of this as a singular time, realize that humanity, we're a fragile bunch, and the planet we live on is fragile. And if we don't respect one another and the very life that sustains us, then that's it for us. So we don't need to sound the alarm now. We just have to recognize, I think, that in every age, human beings have to come together and figure out a way to continue to survive. And we're in that situation again. And our children will be, and our grandchildren, and those generations beyond what we can even imagine are also going to be grappling with these questions. It's never going to go away. We're not going to solve it. We're just got to figure out how we can survive for now and leave something a little bit better for the future.
So I think each of these crises is an opportunity for a solution. So for example, what's happening with Donald Trump in the US right now, in fact, I think will ultimately invigorate American democracy. They might bring in term limits for judges, for example, which would be a good idea, not have the judges there for 40 years. There's all these problems that finally shake the cage and make people think and are the beginning of maybe a solution.
Because we are in the middle of a narrative. We are just arguing about how are we going to tell ourselves the end of the world. So it's an apocalyptic scenario. So I think we should have this kind of meta reflection on what we are saying now as well. We are narrating.
André, and then
Kim, you get the last
one. No, I have just crossed my fingers at everything that Yann said.
Oh, I see.
Leading to change. I wasn't holding up my hand, I was wishing.
Maybe we should all follow you. And when we finish, let's all cross our fingers. On camera. Kim.
Well, I think maybe, I don't know, what I try to do is always to remind ourselves, all of us, that we are capable of kindness more than we think. We are capable of loving more than we think, and we're capable of generosity more than we think. And we always forget that. We always think that we're weak and we have to protect ourselves, and we have to, fight in order to protect ourselves. And we forget that we can be greater than that. And sometimes, like Yann said, it's unfortunate, but we need catastrophe to be heroic, you know, to have heroism. Otherwise, you know, if you don't have refugees, you wouldn't have, they would not have the creation of the High Commissioner for Refugees, and the Red Cross would not have created without catastrophes somehow. And humans are crazy, you know, we need all these extremes in order to become stronger and bigger than ourselves. And so I hope this pandemic and this change, this tragic time that we're going through, will come out of it with a new world order somehow.
Let me just wrap this up with Chelsea's words. I may not have them exactly. We don't need to sound the alarm. We need to figure out how to survive and leave something a little bit better. I think that is a wonderful way of putting it. Can I suggest we all cross our fingers?
Oh, yes.
There you are. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful conversation.
I just want to tell you, I was all uncomfortable with the crossing fingers. In Vietnamese, it's really a bad word. It's like,
oh my God.
Let's do it.
So I'm so shy of doing this, you know. I'm like, oh my God.
There are traps around every corner. There's no way out of it.
But it's great.